Okay, so now we're going to have a hopefully brief look at the system of government in Australia. In Indonesia. I can't be bothered starting again. So let's first of all look at Indonesia's parliament. This is the equivalent to our own parliament, which, remember, is made up of the head of state, the Queen, represented by the Governor-General, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. Alright, so the Indonesian Parliament is the People's Consultative Assembly, which in Indonesian turns into the MPR. The MPR has two chambers, the People's Representative Council, which is the DPR, and the Regional Representative Council. So perhaps a way to remember this, or to remember DPR, it has an R in it, like the House of Representatives, okay? So the DPD is kind of like the Senate here in Australia, although it has a much different role in Indonesia. So although the Indonesian Parliament has two chambers, it is not strictly a bicameral, which means two-chamber, parliament, because the DPD does not have a role in the lawmaking process. The DPR has the final decision to pass, amend, or reject any bill. And I got this information from the PEO document that we all have access to. Alright, so here is a diagram of the two chambers of parliament in Indonesia. Please note that this is the parliament, not the separation of powers. This is actually one branch of power, the legislative branch. So on the left, we have the DPR, the People's Representative Council, which is sometimes called the House of Representatives. And then on the right, we have the DPD, sometimes called the House of Regents. So this is the DPD here. It's kind of like the Senate here in Australia. It represents the interests of states or territories, which are called provinces. So this is like the House of Representatives in Australia. This is like the Senate. It represents the provinces, but this chamber doesn't have lawmaking power. Okay, it's quite interesting. So first up, let's examine the DPR, the People's Representative Council. And remember, this is kind of like our House of Representatives. So as we know, Indonesia won independence in 1949 after many years of Dutch colonization. Indonesia had only two presidents between 1945 and 1998, which is over 50 years. Their first free elections took place after President Suharto resigned. So in 1998, we have the first free elections in over 40 years. And in this instance, in this year, we have 38 seats reserved for military or police. So this is like the House of Representatives. 38 of these seats are reserved for military or police. In 2004, so the seats increased to 550, and all 550 seats were elected, which means that they weren't holding these 38 for the military or police. And in 2009, all 560 seats were elected, so it's gone up another 10 seats. And in 2014, all 560 seats were elected, and 10 political parties are represented. The DPR members represent a constituency, which is like an electorate. constituency may be represented by 3 to 12 members depending on the population. So if you remember in class when let me see if I can actually draw, try and draw this. When we were looking on the board and we were drawing like this part of Australia, and we said if this part had, there we go, if these two parts both had the same amount of people, they would have the same amount of representation. Okay, do you remember that when we're talking about the House of Representatives? I hope that kind of makes sense. I know it's not very clear, but anyway, let's move on. So the DPR powers, it's got about, they can kind of boil them down to 3 powers, which is the legislative power. So it creates and passes laws. It has the final decision to pass, amend or reject any bill. And in Australia, the House of Representatives share this power with the Senate. So the DPR has budgeting, so it produces the annual budget with the President. And it has an overseeing kind of role as well. So it challenges or questions the President and other authorities. And the President cannot dissolve the DPR. Now let's talk about the DPD, the Regional Representative Council. It was established in 2001. It's not a true upper house. The DPD cannot introduce or vote on bills. It has limited authority under the Constitution, and it acts as an advisory body only. This is in contrast to Australia, where both the upper and lower house can introduce bills. Furthermore, in Australia, a proposed law must pass through both houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate, before it becomes a law. So therefore, Indonesia doesn't have a true bicameral parliament. The DPD can advise the DPR and propose recommendations on bills relating to regional matters. So in the DPD, members are elected every 5 years. 4 members from each of Indonesia's 34 provinces are elected. The members represent their provinces, just like the Senate represents states in Australia, or the members of the Senate represent the states in Australia. Remember, we've got 12 senators coming from each of the states. And here's an image of Indonesia's provinces. So here it is here. 4 members from each province make up the DPD, the Regional Representative Council. So 4 members from each of these provinces. And we've got 34 provinces here. Bali somewhere around here. So now that we've looked at the legislature, let's look at the executive. So let's have a look. The Indonesian constitution gives executive power to the president. The president is the head of state, head of government, and supreme commander of the armed forces. Now, in contrast to Australia, the Governor-General represents the head of state, who is the Queen. The Prime Minister, so Malcolm Turnbull at the moment, is the head of government. Okay, so those are just a couple of differences. The President is elected directly by the people of Indonesia. The President appoints ministers and heads of some government institution, for example, the heads of armed forces. And ministers are not members of the MPR, which is the parliament in Indonesia. So they're not members of the parliament, and in fact they can't be members of the parliament. So that's quite interesting. The Australian constitution states that a minister doesn't have to be a member of the parliament, which means a member of either the House of Representatives or the Senate, but that they must become one within 3 months. So the Australian constitution says that they must become a member of parliament and the Indonesian constitution says that ministers are not able to be members of the MPR, which means members of the DPR or the DPD. So, the executive government is made up of the president, the vice president, and high-ranking ministers. So high-ranking ministers are those responsible for leadership of a government department or policy area, such as the Minister for Justice and Human Rights. The President appoints and removes ministers. Ministers must answer to the President for the operation for their department. Ministers can be challenged by the DPR about the operation of the particular department or government spending. And the number of ministers in the cabinet can change. Now this is unlike Australia. So in Australia they have no more than 30 ministers in the executive government, whereas in Indonesia it might change. So similarities between Indonesia and Australia in the executive. The executive government carries out the day-to-day running of the nation, and cabinet meetings are secret, unlike the legislature, and are not subject to public scrutiny. So the cabinet, that is the executive government. The cabinet is the executive government. So the judiciary. In Indonesia, the judiciary is made up of Supreme Court judges. Judges of the Supreme Court are appointed by the President with the approval of the DPR. So we're going to end this video with a key question. So the video has outlined the 3 branches of Indonesian government. So we have the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. Those are the 3 branches of Indonesian government. Thinking back to the video about Australia, what similarities and differences are there between the separation of powers in Australia and the separation of powers in Indonesia? To what extent do Australia and Indonesia have a separation of powers? So how separate are the powers in Australia and Indonesia? This is a point of comparison. It might help to think, how are the 3 branches of government intertwined? What influence does any one part have over another? Okay, so I'm going to leave you with that key question. Thank you for listening.